Hello and welcome to another The History Of. Much like our previous video, we will be covering an entire nation's official camouflage history, rather than one pattern like we usually do. In the last video we covered Rhodesia and its history, and so in this one we will be covering Zimbabwe's. So with no further introductions needed, let's start it up. It's 1980. The Bush War in Rhodesia has finally come to an end, but there is still a bit of unrest. The newly formed Zimbabwe is having a little trouble reforming the Rhodesian security forces into the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. With three factions, the RSF, ZANU-PF, and ZAPU, all now having to work together and assimilate into one single entity, the ZDF, many had a hard time. Because of this, not much focus was initially put into equipping forces with new uniforms and gear. And so for the first few years after Zimbabwe's formation, defense forces continued to use the Rhodesian Brushstroke camouflage, both for uniforms and other pieces of equipment such as tents. However, a new pattern began being seen around 1980, though this new pattern wasn't quite new. No, it was actually based on many of the vertical lizard patterns seen throughout Central African countries during the 60s and 70s. Specifically the Portuguese M1964 vertical lizard pattern, which was worn by troops while operating in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and neighboring Mozambique. This pattern can actually be traced back as early as 1968. It was around this time Rhodesia was still experimenting with the early versions of the brushstroke camouflage pattern. Trialed mainly by BSAP PATU, or the British South Africa Police anti-terrorist units, this vertical lizard pattern saw limited use and was eventually rejected because it was too similar to patterns worn by guerrilla forces. So why did Zimbabwe adopt this pattern? Well, there are a few answers, mainly right off the bat to disassociate itself with Rhodesia. Additionally, patterns like the Portuguese M64 was one of the few camouflages worn by both fighters of ZANLA, the military wing of ZANU, and ZIPRA, the military wing of ZAPU, on a large scale during the Bush War. Using a camouflage that was similar to one worn by both factions was likely an intentional move to help bring unity in the newly created Zimbabwe Defense Forces. And so, for the next few years, the pattern began circulation until it became standard issue around 1984. It boasted two variants. One for the wet season, which had a slightly greener hue to it, and one for the dry season, which was more tan dominant. Although both were issued, the dry season variant was made and seen in far greater numbers. This pattern would gain the nickname Monkey Hand. Though the meaning behind the nickname isn't quite clear, one likely reason is a shape in the pattern itself. If you look closely at the pattern, you'll sometimes notice what looks like a small monkey arm forming into a hand with 4 fingers. This pattern would continue to be worn throughout the 80s and into the second half of the 1990s. It wasn't until early 1995 did Zimbabwe update their uniforms by going back to an older pattern. That pattern? The Rhodesian Brushstroke. Seen by many in the country as controversial, this pattern had a few differences to it. When looked at side by side, you'll notice that they look similar, sharing a few of the same shape designs. However, others have been slightly altered. The main difference, however, is the color scheme, as each color was made a bit brighter. But the most noticeable change, however, was that the brown shapes were printed over the green shapes, whereas the Rhodesian version was the opposite, green printed over brown. So just remember, brown over green, Zimbabwe's camo scheme. Green over brown, Rhodesia's back in town. That rhyme isn't perfect and kinda corny, but
you get the idea.
Anyway, this new pattern would simply be dubbed Zimbabwean Brushstroke and was first seen on a large scale by the global community in November of 2017, when the Zimbabwe Defense Forces removed Robert Mugabe, who had been in office since 1980, from power. When you look at forces wearing the pattern, you'll notice quite often that the shades of color are different, sometimes very subtly and other times very blatantly. On occasion, there have even been instances of the color scheme matching the Zimbabwean brushstroke, but the shape layout being that of the Rhodesian one, green over brown. Though the reason for this isn't explicitly clear, the most likely cause is quality control between fabric and uniform batches, or a lack thereof. There is, however, a lesser-known second variant to this pattern, which saw a larger deviation in the shapes and the colors being generally darker. Whether it's an intentional second variant or just a large-scale quality control oversight, this camouflage can be seen being worn with the standard brushstroke by regular defense forces, as well as recruits of the National Youth Training Program and Youth Militia. One known reason for a color shift was the introduction of ripstop uniforms seen around late 2017, being worn by a few high-ranking officials. As of this video's creation, May 2019, the brushstroke is still standard issue. There is one last pattern that was used, but in a much smaller scale and seen really only on 2 pieces of gear. Those pieces? A chest rig and battle jacket, or vest, however you interpret it. Both based on South African 83 pattern designs, these 2 pieces have been seen in a variety of versions, including solid green, Zimbabwean Brushstroke, and an interesting splatter-type camouflage. This pattern was made up of 4 colors, a grayish-black, brown, tan, and green, and was first seen on chest rigs in a bit of a darker color scheme around the late 80s, with the battle jackets appearing not long after. Not much is known about this camouflage, aside from that the battle jackets with the pattern printed on it were sourced from a company out of Botswana, and that many of these versions can be seen being worn simultaneously. Today, camouflage inside Zimbabwe is only allowed to be worn by members of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, and the country even has a law that states it is illegal for anyone to own and/or wear, quote, any article of wearing apparel made of material carrying military-style camouflage markings. That being said, any piece of Zimbabwe militaria, especially camouflage, is rare and sought after in the collector's market. It also probably explains why the Zimbabwean government never responded to our information requests. If you haven't watched the history of Rhodesia's camouflage patterns, be sure to check that out. Once again, we'd like to thank Discord user Rhodesian Camo. All of his info he's provided was from his research into creating the Rhodesian Brushstroke camouflage on BDUs for Commando Store a few years back. Links to his collection and Commando Store's website are in the description below. Hopefully you found this video entertaining and/or informative, and as we always say, be sure to subscribe or check back for more videos right here on Uniform History. Just throwing this in here so everyone can appreciate and/or totally be confused by Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF suits he wore to events and rallies. They're like literal dazzle political-based camouflage. Okay, that's it. Bye.